Welcome back. Hey, Technical Brad here. Today we are going to look at the original instrumentation that we had on Brownie. I have replaced these gauges for new gauges, and we're going to talk a little bit about the original gauges. This, of course, is the fuel gauge. The fuel gauge was the first one to go out. And that was probably around 87, 88, something like that. The fuel gauge quit working. It was not the gauge, but it was the sending unit, which we have here. And I have taken this apart, but as this would go together, you would have your float here that would pivot up and down here in the housing. Now this mounts onto the front or the side of the fuel tank. These were all side-mounted systems that they had on here. And what we have, if we look here at the end of the float, we have a contact right here. Now that little contact, what that's going to do is that's going to make contact inside here with the rheostat, which is just like tape right through here, this little piece. And if we look at this, we can see that the wires, yeah, they're broken away in there. So this one was worn out, some of them are actually missing in there, but this had worn so much down in here by the contact off the float that the sending unit went bad and thus no longer allowed the gauge itself to register. There are companies, I know here in the US, you could send these things in and they would rebuild them, which means they'd put a new rheostat in here. You would have a range on the sending unit that would match the range on the gauge. And it depends, they're different, but let's say it was 20 ohms to 200 ohms. Generally, the lower number would be your full rating, so that's when the float's in its all the way up position. And then the larger number, in our scenario, 200, would be the empty range. But like I say, this didn't work. I bought new gauges. I got a new Tractormeter here and a new fuel gauge back in 2020, I believe it was. And the reason I did that is because the kit with both of them was like $5 more than the kit than just the one Tractormeter. And the Tractormeter was the main one that I needed. But I got the fuel gauge with it. Of course, put it in, hooked it up, and it still didn't work because the sending unit was bad. Next, we have our temp gauge. The temp gauge is the only gauge that continued to work. This is the original temp gauge. On the David Brown 8355, we have the original sending unit, and it is still functioning fine. We also replaced the gauge on it. One of the reasons is our colorization here is a little faded out, and we'll show a picture of the new stuff. But the big thing with the newer gauges, they were illuminated. These gauges, the original ones, did not have illumination. So at night, they did not light up. So when I got the new Tractormeter and the subsequent fuel gauge, it was like, oh, wow, I got to replace this one because I like them all to be, illuminated at night. And that takes us to the final gauge, which is the Tractormeter. Now, they had basically 4 different versions of Tractormeter. You would get them in miles per hour, which is what we have here. They also had kilometers per hour. Here in the United States, we recognize miles per hour. If you're out on our streets and you see a speed limit sign, it's 30 mile an hour is the speed limit on it. That's the way we also use Fahrenheit instead of Celsius when we're talking about temperatures here in the United States. But we go with miles per hour. And I imagine that David Brown knew that, this particular tractor is going to the US, it gets the mile per hour, and, ones going to other countries would get the kilometer per hour. But another interesting thing about this, they had 2 different versions, and it depended on the ratio of the final drives. And when you look it up in the parts manual, it'll tell you that they have one that is for the 950 ratio, and then they have a different one for the 1149 ratio, and they're different part numbers and everything. And that's what I'm looking at here. As we look down our list here, right here we have 4 different ones here. They're 4 different part numbers, and they're again mile per hours or kilometers per hours, or they're the 950 reductions or the 1149 reductions. So you could get each reduction had 2 different ones, one in mile and one in kilometer per hour. I didn't know that when I was researching, trying to find the new gauges for this. Nothing ever came up about that when looking at these tachometers. So, and that was the ratio that boiled down to the pinion shaft. They had the 950 and the 1149. The pinion shaft came with either a 9 teeth or an 11 teeth on the shaft. And as we look at the drawing here out of the parts manual, we're talking about this shaft right here. Now this comes out through here. It has your drum on it for the brakes. It will be press fitted on there. And then these teeth down here, this is what will fit into your differential. And they had two different ones as listed here because they had a left hand and a right hand side. But there again, they came in the 9 or the 11 teeth. There was 2 for the left and 2 for the right, depending on what your reduction ratio was on there. And like I say, we've got the 1149 on Brownie here. But the thing that happened on this has your miles per hour up here. It has your RPMs down here, and it also has your hours. So this part in the middle is your hour counter. So that's hours at 1412 RPMs. And that's how it registers. Now, slower RPMs, it still counted hours, but it was slower on, how it counted the hours. But the problem with this gauge back in 2000, I believe it was, we had a winter that was beastly cold. We had snow up to our butt cheeks. It just kept snowing every other day, and we were out here, shoveling snow all the time and running out of room to put it because it just kept piling up. And at one point, it was so cold out there that this thing started to grind. And I mean, it made all kinds of noise. And it ground so much that the needles, which we see laying here, fell off of the center part there of our shaft. They just vibrated off of the thing. And it was grinding like crazy. My guess is that we probably had condensation inside the unit, that maybe it warmed up enough to condensate and then froze and caused the gears in here and everything to malfunction. I had to shut the vehicle off. I ended up taking the cable that connects this to the drive unit that's mounted on the engine. I took it loose from the engine and I slid the inner cable out of the outer cable. So it's got two cables. There's an outer casing and an inner casing. The inner one spins, which operates this because it spins off the engine. And you could slide that out and then reattach the outer cable to the engine, and that way we didn't get any kind of dirt or grime or anything like that inside the engine. But those are the original gauges that we have for Brownie, and we're going to go. So this is the cable that I referenced that goes to the tach. This is the drive mechanism down here. Fits into the block. It fits into the block. It runs off of the camshaft, and you have this thumb wheel on here, and you loosen that up, and this whole thing pulls out. We showed you that upon installing the system here, once we got Brownie back together. But it pulls out, and then you have your inner cable, which is this part here, and this turns. And then you have your outer cable, which is this part up here, which is solid. And that could be slid out, that inner cable, and then this whole thing just put back together so that it would seal this whole mechanism back up and keep all the dirt and debris out of it. That was a very quick fix. Yeah, given the weather conditions and all, that was a really good fix for that. And so we tighten that back up. Now to remove the gauges, you first would want to remove the instrument panel, as we showed you in the previous video. And then each one of the gauges, now these two are electrical, so you'd have to remove the electrical wiring from it via the two studs on the back of it. The Tractormeter, now it is a mechanical gauge, so it has a cable that screws on to this fitting here, so you would unscrew that. And then they have these hold down brackets on here. And each one has a bracket that will hold down or clamp it to the actual sheet metal that makes up the instrument panel. And then it's basically just removing the little nuts on here, sliding the brackets off, both of them, like so. And then the gauge would be removed from the front or the outside of the instrument panel. And then installation is just the reverse order. You would slide it back in through the instrument panel. Make sure that you have it lined up so that it is, not off to the side or upside down or anything like that. And then you would replace the brackets with the nuts. And when you tighten them down, it's going to clamp together here between your bracket and the bezel of the gauge onto the sheet metal, and it's going to hold it into place. So the back of our new gauges are illuminated. We have a light here, we have a light up here, and there's one there. So what I did is I hooked these together in a loop and ran them back down to my light switch. And this is actually, I pigtailed the connection here. This is actually the one that goes, this one here goes to the Butler lights up here, both Butler lights. So the instrumentation works with the Butler lights, the fender lights. When they're on, the dash lights are on here, the instrumentation works pretty well. I was thinking about going ahead and maybe getting another, I think this is a 4-position, getting the 5-position switch. You could put them independently. It's really not that big of a deal, but it turned out pretty nice. And we look at our gauges. So as we can see, the color on it is much better, all the printing. They still say AC down here at the bottom. They have the chrome bezel around it, and they are pretty good representations of the original gauges. The difference you will notice on this gauge in particular, it says David Brown right there. The original gauge does not say David Brown on it. So that's one way of knowing, other than the fact that the color is so much better on it. We'll have to check and see if our mile-per-hour ranges here, if those correlate with the other one, given that we have two different ratios that could have run off of. And then, of course, it is illuminated, so as we turn that on, we see that they light up. So that's really nice, too. This one obviously has a little bit more green amber to it there than what these do. But that is quite nice in operating the vehicle at night.